Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I flipped through the channels, eyes glazed over, not really seeing what was on the screen. I was tired, a long workday behind me and an even longer one in front of me. I considered going to bed, but didn't want to bring on a new day any sooner than I had to. I looked around my sparse apartment, searching the floor for my half-finished beer. I spotted it by the couch leg and picked it up, draining the lukewarm contents in one swig. I grimaced and scraped my tongue along my teeth. The TV volume was low, the images on screen making tiny muted sounds as explosive action danced around the four corners of the Sony. I wiped the taste of beer off my molars with my tongue, regretting even drinking it. My tongue paused on the right side of my mouth, prodding the empty space behind my molars on my lower jaw. The skin was sensitive and inflamed. I thought back a couple of years and remembered getting a wisdom tooth pulled from that spot. I explored the space a little more with my tongue and winced, pain spiking along my jawline. What the hell? It felt like there was a cut, the skin slightly separated. I didn't go to the dentist, really, but I always thought I took care of my teeth. I got up and went to the kitchen. I pulled a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water, then salt, something my mother always recommended whenever I had a canker sore. I washed my mouth and spit. I went to the bathroom and brushed my teeth, finally giving in to the late hour. I went around the apartment and turned off the lights, made sure the door was locked, and then turned in for the night. I'm not sure how long I was asleep, but when I awoke my head was killing me. I blinked a few times in the darkness. Why was I awake? Then I realized my mouth was killing me, a pulsing ache in the same spot as before. I gently tested the area with my tongue and immediately pulled away. It was a hot pain, sharp and throbbing. Even moving my jaw was agony. I pulled my covers away and went to the bathroom. I flipped on the light and leaned in toward the mirror, stretching my mouth out. I tilted my head up so the light would shine on my teeth. As the back of my mouth was illuminated, my eyes went wide, and I felt a scream crawl up my throat. Sticking out of my gums, behind my molars, was a tiny finger. It was slowly emerging from the irritated skin like a flatworm, sliding and prodding itself out. Blood squirted from my gums as it wriggled its second knuckle free. It was about an inch long, maybe two, and slender like a newborn's pinky. I screamed, falling back against the wall. I clutched the side of my mouth, heart thundering. What the hell? What the hell? Hands shaking, I stepped forward and back into the light, parting my lips again. There it was, twisting and wriggling on its own accord. I could feel it stroke the side of my cheek from the inside. I suddenly leaned into the sink and vomited, disgusted by the sight of it. I felt the finger recoil back into my gum as the torrent of bile splashed from my mouth. I wiped my lips, chest heaving, and turned on the sink. I watched as the water washed down the chunky yellow globs, my stomach churning. I could feel the finger tapping my teeth, and I cracked my jaw open so fast I heard it pop. The finger was trying to touch my tongue, but I crammed it over on the other side of my mouth. I was shaking so hard at the sight of it that my knees knocked together. It was like seeing a spider dangling over my face. I needed to vacate the space as fast as I could. Get it out of your mouth, I thought. Get that damn thing out of your mouth. Slowly I reached inside my mouth. I didn't want to touch the wretched thing, but my mind was having a meltdown. I felt like I was going to pass out, the shock and horror of what was growing out of my gums overwhelming my senses. I gripped the little bastard, fighting the urge to recoil as the tiny finger flopped around in my grip like a caterpillar. I pinched it between my fingers, capturing it between my thumb and pointer finger, and pulled up. I let a howl out as pain erupted like lightning, spreading across my mouth and down my throat. I released the finger and stood, panting over the sink, drool leaking from my lips in long, thick strands. I had to get this thing out of my mouth, right now. Suddenly, a new pain blossomed. It was sharp and piercing, quick stabs of pain along the inside of my cheek. I cried out and opened up, my bloodshot eyes staring into my gaping mouth. The finger had grown a long, sharp nail, and it was poking me with it. I jerked my head back in agony as it drove its needle-like fingernail into the bottom of my mouth. I coughed and spit out a wad of blood and saliva, head pulsing. Before it could do it again, I looked back into the mirror and grabbed the finger. Squeezing my eyes shut, I began to pull. A scream rattled my throat as I increased the pressure. I felt my gums splitting as I attempted to uproot the thrashing finger. I knew if I let go, it was all over. I wouldn't be able to do it twice. Tears streaming down my face, I heard a sound, like grass slowly being pulled from the earth. I forced my eyes open, blood dribbling out of my mouth and down my chin. In the mirror, I saw that my gums were ripping open, making room for the rest of the fingers. I had a whole hand growing in my mouth. I gagged on my own blood and spit, watching as the other 4 fingers balled into a fist. It was trying to make it harder for me to grip it free. With my other hand, I gripped the one holding the finger, and together I tugged as hard as I could. I saw stars as my vision blackened with pain, my screams deafening. I felt warmth pour from my ruined mouth in thick, wet streams. Suddenly, and with a sick, sucking noise, like pulling your foot free from thick mud, I pulled the squirming appendage from my mouth. Still screaming, fighting a full-on blackout, I looked at it. It was covered in blood, its white skin reminding me of uncooked dough. Its tiny wrist bone protruded from the hand, flayed with strips of wet flesh. Balling the monstrosity in my fist, I threw it in the toilet. I slammed down the lever and watched in trembling relief as it began to swirl around the bowl. It scrambled like a spider, frantically trying to gain traction and not be pulled down into the depths of the sewers. Still struggling, I watched it disappear into the toilet as the bowl emptied. I flushed that thing 8 more times just to be sure. When I was convinced it wasn't going to come crawling back up, I went to the sink to clean up. I washed my mouth out and looked at my busted gums. I felt sick, my stomach full of blood, swallowed during the ordeal. More blood pooled from my ruptured gums. They were cracked and torn open, and I knew I needed to go to the hospital. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, and sick. I went to get my keys, but collapsed on the floor as a new pain shook my body. Groaning, I tried to stand, but curled in on myself. I felt like there was something trying to crawl its way out of my stomach. Please, no.
The boys had one thing in common. 2 things if you count being overly curious. Both were troubled loners. I'd seen the trade before. They seemed more comfortable wandering the prairie or looking for trouble. Sheep's Creek is part of the Lakota territories. The territory belongs to our ancestral tribe. Sheep's Creek Formation is located here. The region of Sheep's Creek is home to this geological gold mine of digs from the Neogene period. The Neogene period included the woolly mammoth and horses the size of small cars. The land exists in western Nebraska, somewhere between here and there. Sheep's Creek has a dark reputation. People have gone missing there for years. The locals refuse to admit there's a problem. They don't want to disturb the paranormal income stream. Since perpetuity, our people have lived peacefully with the region's celestial ghosts, Wanachi. But this story is not about me, spirits, or the time-space continuum. It's about two boys. They'd visited the abandoned Johnson farmhouse on multiple occasions. What was left of the farmstead was located in the central plains of western Nebraska, near an area known as Sheep's Creek. The ghostly buildings of Sheep's Creek are located a little north of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, a region well known for sugar beets and sugar beet processing factories. Over the many storied years, most farmers found it impossible to make a living in the area. Corporate farming has taken over. Running a small farming outfit took more work and was physically demanding. Not even when drunk, no acre of geography in the region could force a smile on the face of a small farmer. Summers were hell. Winters were hell, only colder. The Johnsons packed up and left years ago. At least, that is what the locals will tell you. Charlie's father, Ebed Abner, had slowly become one of those failed farmers. He had to supplement his meager income by working part-time at minimum wage at the local sugar beet plant, Western Sugar. Ebed had abandoned Joy years ago, though he didn't know it then. Infertile land will do that to you. He'd taken over the rundown farm from his dead father, Ezekiel. It was a prairie tradition. Ebed was a predictable man. Emma saw that as an anchor that was dragging her down. Emma, or M as he called her, always appeared in his nightmares. He was so blue, he often slept with one of her empty perfume bottles under his piss-yellow pillow. Ebed had stolen the essence container from her goodbye suitcase just before he'd taken her down to the Greyhound Depot in Scottsbluff. She was hell-bent on proving her intelligence by abandoning the entire family. She left in the winter of 2002. Rats love sugar beets. If you work at Western Sugar and haven't been bitten by a rat, the workers, men and women, refer to you as a pussy. They looked for little William Drake. Okay, maybe easier than they'd look for someone who was likable or had a better social standing, but at least they put in the effort. Billy's best friend, Charlie Abner, 12, refused to search back then. Charlie knew better. That winter seemed colder than ever, but it wasn't. After nearly a year, Sheep's Creek gave up on Billy. Worst, his memory was long gone and buried nearly 2 years after he disappeared. His family was destined never to celebrate one day of his life. Charlie and Billy had explored every inch of the desolate territory near Sheep's Creek. There were abandoned wells to rappel down, deserted houses to explore, and the occasional farm that nature had taken back. As sure as the factory's sugar beet rats gained physical stature, so had their predators. Bobcats became lions, coyotes turned into wolves, and swallows evolved into goshawks. They'd visited the old Mackenzie farmhouse on multiple occasions, Billy and Charlie. Oh, sure, a family had been butchered there back in the 19th century. All the kids in town had talked about that incessantly, but that wasn't the reason they'd loved to explore the old place. Some say Nebraska's only UFO had been spotted hovering over the fallen Mackenzie shitstorm. But that wasn't the only reason the two boys loved the imploded wooden graveyard farm. It's what they imagined lived inside the main farmhouse. Fickle Natalie Clements ignored the doctor's recommendations down at Scottsbluff Medical. She was a protective mother. "It's just in case that goddamn rat had rabies," said Dr. Vindrickson. "We better schedule your daughter for a series of required shots in Omaha, Mrs. Clements." "Hell nah, Dr. Vindrickson. From what I've heard, those shots are some painful shit. The needles are about a foot long." Facing such resistance, all the physician could do was patch up the young girl. It wasn't pretty. He had a hunch none of this would end well. Within a month, Mother Natalie wouldn't ever be fickled another day in her life again. Her daughter, Sue's lips had swollen so much that they exploded. Natalie couldn't get enough iced water down her daughter's throat. The family ordered the caretaker to keep the lid on the casket closed at the funeral. The day the girl was buried, a local preacher said some excellent words over her, and for good measure, he threw some dirt in the rocky hole. She was buried in the Sheep's Creek Presbyterian Church Cemetery. On that gray day, sadness hung in the sky like a dark gray bridge about to collapse. Reverend Sparkles never mentioned the oversized rats once. That was in 2006. Over time, Billy and Charlie learned a lot about the oversized rats. They were everywhere, but mostly at the local sugar beet factory. At Western Sugar, they mostly dined on sugar beets. Not just sugar beets, but some of the largest and sweetest sugar beets on the planet. If sugar was cocaine, those damned rats would be constantly jacked up. The rat problem was so bad at the factory that the top boss in Omaha had actually assigned the plant mechanic an additional work function. He was ordered to prioritize his work based on the number of rats that needed killing. The other workers gave him the extra title of Pyramid Head, just like the vicious killer in the popular video game Silent Hill. Pyramid loved his new work title, by the way. Mr. Pemberton was one hell of a mechanic and an even better butcher. He killed giant rats in a number of disgusting ways. Most thought of him as sadistic and that he took his extra work assignment too personally. Pyramid Head could fix anything that ticked or clanked funny, except when his heart ran out of gear oil. They'd found Pyramid Head, at least most of them, deceased under a well-greased conveyor assemblage that had frozen up. It was on a late Saturday night. His face was mostly eaten away. Somehow he'd fallen into a mess of rusty moving metal parts that tossed him around and chewed him up pretty good. Parts of him had fallen through the moving assembly, causing the entire operation to grind to a halt. Jesus, his beer belly was missing. Don't get me wrong. Mr. Pemberton, or Pyramid Head, was ugly. He had Sharpay eyelids and jumbo-sized ears. He wore his smile crooked, but that had nothing to do about how his looks had been ruined. In fact, most of his face had been removed, including his nose, ears, and lips. His funeral service was at the Episcopal Chapel and included a closed coffin. Many locals attended. The authorities never blamed Mr. Pemberton's death on the depraved, contaminated rats. Pyramid's worn-out ticker was responsible for that. Still, most of us workers disagreed. They were suspicious. The forklift driver discovered Pyramid Head requested a few days off work without pay. As far as the rest of our graveyard shift, we were desperate to keep feeding our families. When you're hungry, you can overlook a lot of crazy shit for a steady paycheck. Rumors of celestial beings and the horrors of furry creatures blew in off the Great Plains that winter in gales. Maybe one of those crazed beavers from down off the Platte River tore him apart, just maybe. Sissy, a machine operator, smoked a lot of ganja on the night shift. It didn't take much to give her the munchies or challenge her warped imagination. "Hell no," said Gus in the break room. "It was a woodchuck. I've seen him that big," he said. Gus was the night shift foreman. He'd be town mayor material if Sheep's Creek had such a thing. And then there was Jensen and his 2 cents. Jensen was a gruff young man who'd spent most of his adult life in the sugar beet plant. He might have gotten the closest. After all, he had a high school diploma, even though it had only taken him around 6 years. "Nope," he said with authority. "I'm sure Pyramid Head was gnawed to death by a much larger predator. Maybe it was a wildcat or a supersized coyote." Knowing the sugar plant was cavernous enough to hide a tiger, Jensen had captured the crew's imagination, even though what he said was impossible. And yet, everyone kept an eye out for the different creatures going forward, including the ones with orange and black stripes. A storm of years had stacked themselves as high as snowdrifts over the desolate Sheep's Creek prairie. Charlie has been attending college. He'd returned to Sheep's Creek on Thanksgiving break. He was in his third year at Wayne State. He had yet to decide on a major. Charlie was cautious, not knowing what the future held. Oh, Charlie had taken an extra week off. His father had died. It was 2018, and no one had died from COVID yet, at least nobody in Sheep's Creek. Charlie needed to tie some legal knots together before returning to school, including getting his father buried, after he'd planned on leaving the prairie town for good. Charlie's dad had been eaten alive. What remained of Ebed were bones, hollowed-out bones with most of the marrow having been sucked out. He'd been discovered by a Sheep's Creek volunteer fire department member. He'd been found about a quarter-mile south of the old Mackenzie farmstead, the well-known haunted farmhouse. It would take a few days to identify him for sure. A Scottsbluff medical examiner had to be paid to identify the body and conduct the autopsy. But the local mortician knew it was Ebed, for God's sake. He recognized him by the boots that held the splintered leg bones. Ebed's boots were more holes than leather. The cause of death was listed as consumption. Most of Ebed's throat was missing, and all of his innards. Little was left in terms of flesh and meat. His calves, thighs, and ass had been consumed. Many of the bones had been cracked as if he'd been dropped out of a dark Nebraska sky. Some looked like a hickory-handle axe had chopped them. Charlie was confident the haunted Mackenzie farmhouse played a part in his father's demise. Before Charlie entered the ghostly farmhouse, he cracked open the double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun he'd retrieved from his old bedroom closet. He'd killed plenty of bad angels with the powerful gun. Charlie and his father, Ebed, had often joked about how beautiful pheasants were, all dressed up in their freckled red, green, and translucent feathered capes. "They look like angels, Pops." The words circled inside Charlie's skull like a rollerblade grudge match without a proper exit. He removed 2 buckshot shells from his canvas coat pocket, dropping his gloves in the snow. Thunk, thunk. Each yellow cylinder seated itself in its barrel with only the brass rim saving them from falling through. Charlie snapped the barrel shut. Clack. Next, he calculated his steps up to where a door once hung. With both feet on the threshold, he reminisced about the rotting stench of the farmhouse. He also caught a whiff of freshly baked biscuits on a different wavelength, recently removed from Time's oven. He peered deeply into the kitchen where he imagined a family breakfast. Around an old farmhouse table, a family was smiling and laughing. With a resounding screech from above, they all disappeared. It was still there, the evil presence he and Bobby had discussed. Charlie strained against his thoughts, finally pulling them out of some dark wormholes. He remembered hearing about the Mackenzie family and what his father had said was left of them. He picked up the scent of blood from under the kitchen floorboards. The Mackenzies, at least most of their plasma, had been mixed with frozen dirt below. It was coagulated and sappy. Charlie cracked the barrel open again. Snap. He needed to reassure himself he'd loaded the gun outside in the cold Nebraska winter. He needed to prove he wasn't hallucinating. His hands ached. His fingers were purple, gloveless. And there it was again, that exciting sound. Charlie had always interpreted the sound as something that came from a dragon. His friend Billy had heard the sound, and he'd sought out the danger on his own like a moth to a flame. Charlie stood silent at the base of the common stairwell and gazed upward. There was a fetid smell. It was fresh rat blood. He'd experienced it once when he and his mother had dropped his father's lunch at the beet factory. The beet factory was nothing if not a sweet mix of sugar, rat guts, and rat shit. Nothing moved at Western Sugar Beet Factory unless it was greased with the scent of rats. Large, impossibly sized rats the size of vicious bulldogs. Each valve, switch, and gear had been lubed with their greasy decay. Unless you were new at the facility, killing rats at Western Sugar was something you did to keep your job. The parent corporation had no time to wet nurse any of its employees. Production was life. Westerners spent more on death bait than on fake gold retirement watches. Charlie thought the sound was somehow different this late in the day, though. It was more guttural and disturbing. He licked his lips as he placed one boot over the other up the wooden steps. He wiped the nearly frozen snot from his upper lip using his nearly frostbitten hand. He felt his lips. They were numb. Charlie imagined each step a wooden drum, each step leading him closer to the hangman's gallows. The floor in the master bedroom buckled and creaked. The wind howled down the stairs, cold and alien-like, an iced cold stream from another planet. Icy fingers of wind raced down the back of Charlie's flannel collar. His vertebrae were freezing piano keys. The sweet melody of Beethoven's Für Elise slowly played in his mind. This version was Germanic and dark. They'd both wanted to kill the thing, he and Bobby, for the longest time. It had taken all their courage. But now, Bobby was gone. Charlie was alone. So alone and frightened. Near the top of the steps, light and dark exchanged places. Daylight had thickened into the glue of impending darkness. Impossibly so, the lack of oxygen caused Charlie's fingertips to tingle as he gripped the shotgun's triggerworks. Charlie looked down at the gun to draw courage from it. He advanced forward, ever slowly. He stopped at the master bedroom threshold. A door once hung there. Brass hinges are now gone, along with knob and door hinges. He peered into the nearly empty room. Fear coated the back of his throat with the taste of rust and iodine. The room appeared empty, except for a faceless chest of drawers and a crooked family photo on a vacant wall. He lifted his eyes upward. He examined the jagged, body-sized hole in the ceiling. Sundown snowflakes sifted through the ceiling opening. Obviously, the roof had a large hole in it. Something intuitive and ancient inside him had told him to run. That avenging anyone or anything is like a body without bones. It can never exist. It took all of Charlie's strength to shove the laminated vestibule. He stopped shoving just under the gaping black hole in the ceiling. Run, run. Native Chance advised him to run and never look back. His skull was a drum. Charlie ignored the warning signs. He hoisted himself up on top of the dresser. He could hear the shuffling sound in the attack, but he repressed the sound. Next thing you know, he watched himself lifting the shotgun through the opening and placing it on the floorboard above. Using all his strength, he lifted himself through the slivery opening. Somehow, after sitting, he found his footing, standing with the loaded shotgun. He became disoriented and dizzy. The smell of ammonia was feasting on the room's oxygen. Charlie nearly fainted, falling to the floor. On the floor, he began to crawl. He crawled several feet while dragging his shotgun by its barrel. Charlie bumped into what appeared to be a large nest. Raccoons, he thought? But no, the nest was the size of a woodpile. Charlie lost his breath. Surely his ribcage would explode from the anxiety. He placed his left hand on his chest. His chest swelled, deflated, much too fast, he thought. No, he didn't imagine anything. In the dim light, dog-sized carcasses, fur, and the bones of large animals had been strewn over the attic floor. And then there were these pellets, smelly pellets the size of bowling balls with a mixture of jawbones and teeth. He would have sworn they were owl pellets if he didn't know any better. Chatter spilled over the side of the nest. Charlie attempted to prop himself up and peer into the nest. He laid his arm on the edge of it, attempting to pull himself up. Pink, fleshy creatures latched onto Charlie's left arm, all beak and wrinkled leather. Their beaks were scythes. They deboned much of his flesh in an instant before he could tug away what was left of his arm. Charlie reeled back, hitting the floor with a bang. He skittered on his ass until he hit the exposed wall. Instinctually, he quickly removed the yellow bandana he'd placed around his face to keep the stink at bay. Charlie hurriedly turned the bandana into a rope using his hand, right arm, and teeth. He cinched the yellow rope around the splintered bone and flesh to stop the bleeding. He wanted to cry out for his mother. Something dropped into the attic through the larger hole in the roof, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet. It appeared to be a griffin. Charlie's mind turned into a horror pinwheel. In ancient times, it was believed that these creatures were half lion and half eagle. Griffins, their front paws sporting eagle talons. Charlie remembered this from school. The creature had an owl's face and a lion's body. It slowly moved toward Charlie, its claws scraping against the boards on the floor. Charlie held his breath, hoping it would disappear. Directly in front of Charlie, the creature spread its wings, filling the room like a beautiful feathered geisha fan. It flapped its wings as it jumped up and down, clacking its claws and wildly shrieking. With its forked tongue extended, it appeared more dragon than an owl. Its long tail whipped back and forth, striking the ceiling and walls. Feathers covered most of the creature's tawny face, just not enough to hide its beautiful emerald eyes. And then suddenly, its shape shifted, drawing closer to Charlie, its face now more rodent than avian. The magnificent beast was so close. Charlie could smell its fleshy snout and the decades of decay between its sharp yellow teeth. The creature gnashed its teeth as it moved forward. Its head was massive, an owl, a rat, and then a lion. Charlie pulled hard on both triggers. In an instant, it was over. The sweet smell of ignited gun smoke bellowed and filled all the grayness of the sizable attic. The monster had fallen against the side wall and pile of decayed wooden rafters. Blood poured from its throat as it gargled and frantically spun out of control, finally stilling. Oddly enough, the first thing Charlie imagined was living a good life, only without his left arm. Somehow he'd manage. Hell no, he'd thrive somehow. He'd eventually marry and have a family of his own. He'd end up anywhere other than the state of Nebraska. And yet, it wasn't meant to be. As the 3 hatchlings tortured their throats for more food, Charlie whispered, "Quiet, quiet, please." Then louder, "God damn to quiet down, you crazed bastards." Charlie wasn't himself. He was enraged. His screaming voice only served to inspire the bloodthirsty spawn. That's when Charlie observed how dark the attic had grown. Something had covered the giant gaping hole in the cedar rooftop above him. Fitting itself through the large hole in the pitched roof, another creature appeared. Only it was larger and fiercer looking. It was the father of whatever had taken his left arm. As his wings receded, the larger beast dropped dog-sized rats into the nest. The nest churned with fur, flesh, and blood. Tar-filled blood flowed over the top of the nest. The muck was filled with squirming maggots. Thinking this new creature must be confused, Charlie watched as it stomped in the blood of its mate. Charlie held his ears as if to keep them from exploding. Decibels of shrill, bone-chilling screeches shuffled the shingles and rafter. Feathers morphed into razor blades and scales as the creature's claws turned into curved knives. Evil's beak was now a guillotine. It quieted and sized up Charlie, all the while communicating. Yes, the creature spoke in an ancient language using silent syllables fully understood by Charlie. Charlie fumbled to reload his Browning shotgun, to no avail. His fingers were icicles. With his right hand, he clawed at the bottom of his brown canvas coat pocket. He'd used up most of his ammo while practicing on imaginary targets. There had to be one last shell. Charlie cracked open the shotgun. He placed the invisible plastic shell in the gun's chamber. He pointed the barrel at the magnificent creature. Everything was possible, he thought. In turn, the entity walked toward Charlie on its paws of knives. It raised the upper part of its beak until its tongue protruded. Charlie swore he was looking into the eyes of a tiger. Charlie pulled the trigger as the monster's face turned into his mother's face, his father's face, and then his beloved friend Bobby's face, the part that remained of it. Nothing. Instantly, the monster relaxed. In Bobby's voice, it spoke. "And so, where did all this avenging get us, Charlie?" The massive creature shape-shifted for the last time into something horrid and unrecognizable. It began to peck the clothing away from Charlie's body. It pecked out Charlie's eyes. It took flesh in portions from Charlie's body. Feeding the hatchlings would be a priority. It would be a long, cold winter.
A woman's voice floated from the speakers overhead.
Dr. Harper, please report to Laboratory 3. Dr. Harper, please report to Laboratory 3.
The word please almost amused him, like they were asking, like he had a choice. Harper slowly sat up on the couch in the doctor's lounge and pulled his gaze from the useless TV, whose only function seemed to be showing no signal on the screen in a baleful blue. The clock on the wall showed 4:15 in the morning. Harper sighed and stood, stretching his back until he felt a series of satisfying pops. He ran his hand over the front pocket of his pants, checking for his cell phone that wasn't there. He grimaced, remembering they had confiscated it before he boarded the plane. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridor. It was early, but he still expected to run across an overworked resident running their rounds, or a custodian taking the opportunity to work in peace. The silence made him afraid, and that's what he hated most of all. Fear could be useful, he thought. It could be a warning, but mostly it was an annoyance. The hall opened up into Methodist Willowbrook Hospital's lobby, where 2 armed guards eyed him as he approached. The fluorescent lights reflected off their shiny black helmets and polished boots. "Identification, please," the one on the left said, holding out his hand. He looked all of 19 years old with a round, soft face. Harper kept walking.
"I'm about to be late. Now, if you don't mind..."
The boy placed his hand on Harper's chest. "ID. Now, please." The boy's partner tensed, and the barrel of his rifle rose. Not much, but enough for Harper to notice. Harper stepped back.
"Keep your hands off me. Does your mother know you're out this late, asshole?"
"Stand down, Evans," a voice said from the lobby. A man rose from one of the love seats and approached them. The man's helmet dangled from a clip on his body armor, clicking against a rifle slung across his chest. Where the 2 guards were dressed in black tactical gear, the man was in military fatigues. Army or Marines, Harper guessed, but didn't care either way. The man stepped between the guards. "I'm Staff Sergeant James, NCO in charge of these 2 gentlemen tonight. And you are?" Harper did his best to keep his annoyance from showing on his face.
"I'm Dr. Keith Harper, and I'm late for a very important meeting. I'm expected..."
"Dr. Harper. Keith. Can I call you Keith?" Before Harper could tell James that he could not, in fact, use his first name, the man had taken hold of his arm and led him a few feet away from the other guards. "Listen, Keith.
We're not friends. You don't get to..."
"As I was saying, Keith, you're on your way to a meeting, right?"
"Yes. I told you..."
"You have a job to do." James gestured to the guards. "These boys have a job to do, too. Their job is to guard this entrance. So, why don't you let them do their job so you can go do yours?" Harper shook with anger, his fists clenched at his sides.
"Look, I've been dragged halfway across the country. I'm exhausted, and I'm in no mood for this. Now, if you will excuse me...
I don't.
What?
I don't excuse you.
You cannot detain me here.
James smiled. And that is one of the many ways you are wrong, Doctor. I can detain you. See, this is my lobby. No one goes through my lobby without me saying so. Now, show your ID to those nice fellows there, and you can be on your way. It's that easy.
Fine,
Harper growled.
You want to act like we're under martial law? Go ahead, but you'll hear about this later.
James's laugh filled the empty lobby. See, Doc, I told you, so many ways to be wrong. If you'd taken 2 seconds to wonder why Army personnel were in charge of a couple of local SWAT guys, you might have figured it out for yourself. As of midnight, you are under martial law. Harper's mouth had gone dry.
That's impossible.
You want to see something impossible? When you get up to the 3rd floor, take a look out the window. Now, flash your ID to the guards, get the fuck out of my lobby, and have a nice day. Harper reached his shaky hand into his coat pocket and slowly withdrew his ID badge. The guard glanced at it. Thank you, Doctor. You may proceed. Harper's lips twitched, straining to hold back a stinging remark. James's smile was gone. He simply cocked his head to the side away from the hall. His face burning, Harper brushed past the guards and into the lobby. Within a few strides, he passed a tall bronze statue of Jesus, his hand on a kneeling woman.
A lot of help you were,
he spat at the statue. He reached the elevator and stabbed his finger at the button. The door slid open, and he stepped inside. Harper slammed his fist against the wood paneling.
Who the fuck does he think he is?
He cried.
Stupid fucking pseudo-alpha males and their guns.
Dr. Harper?
The woman's voice said through a speaker above his head, but this time she was a little less pleasant.
Please report to Laboratory 3, Dr. Harper. Please report to
I'm coming, goddammit,
he said, punching the button for the 3rd floor. The elevator lurched upward. Harper closed his eyes and tried to slow his breathing, willing himself to calm down. This is why he hated fear, because it turned him into a goddamn mess. He could feel his pulse in his neck and loathed the hammer and thump of it. By the time the doors opened onto the 3rd floor, he had mostly composed himself. He stepped quickly out into the hall, telling himself his fast stride was purposeful and not panicked. Dr. Granger stood outside the stainless steel double doors that led into Lab 3, along with some woman he didn't know. She was probably mid-50s, and her silver hair brushed the shoulders of her navy suit. Harper forced himself to smile as he approached.
I apologize for being late. I had a little run-in with the guards.
Granger cleared his throat, beads of sweat running from the top of his bald head.
Dr. Harper, this is Dr. Ann Schneider, Deputy Director of the CDC. She's flown in from Atlanta to, observe. Dr. Harper, it's a pleasure to meet you,
Schneider said, holding out her hand. Harper shook it.
You as well, Deputy Director. I appreciate you flying in on such short notice, but your expertise may help to understand what's going on here. It might,
Harper said.
If I had any idea what was going on here. I was pulled away from dinner by some general who put me on a plane and said it was a matter of national security. I apologize ahead of time if I seem a little out of sorts. Of course,
Schneider said.
I had a very similar experience myself, and here we are. Remind me, Doctor, what is it you specialize in?
Harper wanted to sigh, but suppressed the urge. Hadn't she just mentioned his expertise?
Cell biology and physiology. Specifically, physiological bone remodeling.
She nodded, but her eyes seemed far away.
That sounds fascinating. Yes, I think so at least,
Harper said.
So, what's this about? I mean, obviously, it's about whatever is going on in Houston, but I don't know what it has to do with me.
Granger pushed open one of the doors.
Please, come in and we can talk about it privately.
Harper followed them in. The lab was split into 2 sections. One side was filled with various monitors beeping at intervals, and 2 rows of mismatched chairs that Harper was fairly sure were dragged in just for this purpose. He walked over to the large window that separated their side of the room from the other and rapped gently on the glass. A mint green curtain obfuscated the view, only showing the smeared shadows of people at work.
What's this lab used for?
He said, turning back to Granger.
Its intended use is to treat patients with highly communicable diseases, but in the past 11 years I've been at this hospital, we've never had to use it, thank God. So whoever is in there is contagious?
Schneider hushed Granger with a look.
The truth is, we don't know,
she said.
At this point, we don't know how it spreads, or even what it is. We just know what happens to the infected.
Harper didn't like the tone of her voice. There was something behind it. Fear? Definitely. But he thought he heard excitement there as well.
And just what is it that happens?
Harper said, not entirely sure he wanted the answer. Granger stepped past him and thumbed the button on a nearby intercom.
This is Dr. Granger. Open the curtain.
One of the shadows moved behind the veil and the curtain was drawn back. A man lay on a bed in the middle of the room. The bright white of the light shone down on his sweaty, jaundiced skin. His chest heaved with every ragged breath he managed to draw in past the heavy leather restraints that secured him to the bed.
This is Matthew Pastor,
Granger said.
He was a few blocks away from Ground Zero. He somehow managed to make it to his truck and drove away from downtown. They stopped him as he tried to ram through a barricade the National Guard had stood up on Highway 45. They didn't know what to do with him, so they brought him here. Wait, Ground Zero?
Harper said.
Last I heard, there was some rioting going on or something. What the hell happened? Terrorists?
Granger and Schneider exchanged a look. On the other side of the glass, the sallow man bucked against his restraints and screamed. Harper felt every hair on the back of his neck stand up.
What is this, Granger? What has he got? Soon,
Schneider said.
I'll tell you what we know, but now we just need you to observe.
Granger keyed the intercom once more.
Make sure the cameras are rolling, then get out of there.
There was a flurry of movement as the masked doctors in the other room did their last-minute checks and gathered their instruments. And in less than a minute, the room was empty save for Matthew Pastor. The doors opened on their side of the glass, and the doctors came spilling into the room, talking fast and grabbing up nearby seats. Granger gently led Harper away from the glass. They both stood against the wall and waited. Pastor screamed again and threw himself against the straps. Harper watched as the man struggled, his veins showing green beneath his yellow skin, his breathing quickening as he began to hyperventilate.
Very soon now,
Granger whispered. The bed shook with Pastor's wild movements, and suddenly there was a snap as loud as a gunshot as one of the leather straps holding Pastor's wrist gave way. He quickly pivoted and dug his fingers beneath the strap on his opposite wrist and pulled, tearing away the restraint and flinging it across the room. Harper grabbed Granger by the arm.
Do something for Christ's sake!
Granger only shook his head weakly.
Nothing we can do now.
Pastor flexed his chest and the strap there snapped like an overstretched rubber band. He sat up and made quick work of the ankle restraints. He rolled from the bed, clutching his head and crying out.
Help me! I got someone help!
His words were cut short as he slammed his head against the floor. Blood fanned out from his split scalp. Pastor raised his head and looked to the window. Harper stood transfixed. Pastor nodded to no one, his face drawn and bloody. He placed both hands flat against the floor, raised his head high and slammed it forward once again. The sound of the man's skull cracking was much louder than Harper would have imagined. He'd cut into skulls for research purposes, yes, but had never witnessed something like this. This was primal. Dazed, Pastor stood on wobbling legs and fell against the window. He rested there, his breath sending patterns of fog across the glass. The wound on his forehead was red, and his cracked skull showed through it, shockingly white. Harper had had enough. He was done watching this man torture himself while everyone stood around and...
There! There!
Granger said breathlessly.
Look there, Harper!
Harper didn't want to, but he did. The crack in the man's skull began to grow as flakes of bone spread out like a blooming flower. Protrusions and knobs snaked from between the petals, hardening in front of the man's face like malformed horns.
That isn't possible,
Harper said, his eyes dry and unblinking.
That kind of growth isn't possible.
Pastor turned his head towards Harper's voice, his new horns digging furrows into the glass with a screech. The jaundice had spread from the corners of the man's eyes and into the blue irises, staining them a sickly green.
You're right, Dr. Harper,
Schneider said, seeming to appear out of nowhere at his side.
It shouldn't be possible, but it is. And that's where you come in.
Harper shook his head, his thoughts a jumbled mess.
I've got to... If you'll excuse me.
He shouldered past them and shoved the doors open. The air in the hall was blessedly cooler than in the observation room, and he breathed it in greedily. Harper slowly paced the floor, trying not to think about what he had just witnessed, but the crooked points of bone wouldn't leave his mind.
Get it together,
he said, rubbing his hands over his face.
It's science. It's new, but it's all science. You can figure it out. Just have to calm down and...
He trailed off as he looked to the window at the end of the hall, the words of the sergeant downstairs running through his head. You want to see something impossible? When you get up to the 3rd floor, take a look out the window. And that's what Harper did. The early morning sunlight was a serene mixture of orange and pink. It bathed the cars in the lot below and lit up the dew on the leaves of the trees just to the south. It was a beautiful Texas morning, a different kind of sunrise than he was used to in Chicago, where the light had to find its way through the skyscrapers first. Dr. Granger's footsteps clicked towards him, but he barely noticed, just continued to stare. In the distance was a bruise on the horizon, a massive spot of livid purple and diseased green.
What is that?
Harper said as much to himself as Granger.
That,
Granger said,
is downtown Houston. Is it?
Harper began, trying to find words to fit.
Is it radiation? Or clouds? Both? Why is it just hanging there? It's not clouds,
Granger said.
And it's not just hanging there. It's spreading from the ground up, like a bubble or something. Military guys are calling it the scab. Why? Because the uppermost parts of it are hardening, like a crust. Still, no one knows what it is or where it's coming from.
Harper rubbed his temples, then ran his hands through his hair, exhaling loudly.
And what exactly does that thing out there have to do with the young man in the lab growing horns at an alarming rate?
Granger sighed and looked back to the window.
Anyone who's been caught in the scab has come out like poor Matthew Pastor. Strong, angry, and out of control. Hell-bent on causing trauma to himself to break his bones.
Harper interrupted.
That's it, isn't it? The bone must be broken for new growth to occur. It triggers some sort of mutation or... Shit, I don't know, but it feels right. You may be right, Harper, but we just don't have more info to...
The crash of broken glass echoed through the hall, followed by cries and screams. One of the masked doctors ran from the lab, slamming the door behind him.
He's broken containment! Go!
The door buckled in the middle and flew free of its hinges, slamming into the doctor and sending him sprawling to the opposite wall as Matthew Pastor erupted through the doorway. The doctor raised both hands in a warden gesture before Pastor reached between them and grabbed the doctor by the head, covering his face.
Please!
The doctor said, his voice muffled by Pastor's palm.
Please don't!
Pastor squeezed, the muscles of his forearm flexing hard enough to split the yellowing skin. Harper could hear the man's skull cracking, the sound like faraway gunshots. Blood ran from his eyes and soaked into his mask. Harper's shocked stupor was broken by Granger grabbing his shoulder.
Come on, we have to help him.
Harper shook his head slowly. He felt like he was waking up from a deep sleep as his brain fog dissipated and his muscles prepared to fire. He slung Granger's hand away from him.
He's dead already,
Harper said.
And we will be too if we don't get out of here now.
Granger sneered at him.
Coward,
he said, and rushed toward Pastor. Harper didn't bother with a retort and instead sprinted for the stairs, taking them two at a time, pushing the fear of falling out of his head. He was nearly to the first floor when he heard Granger's screams descend eerily through the stairwell. He flung the stairwell door open wide and stopped himself before he ran headlong into Staff Sergeant James. Well, if it isn't Keith, your very important meeting is already over? Must not have been.
He's coming,
Harper said between pants of heavy breathing.
You've got to stop him. He's killed at least 2 people, maybe more. I don't know.
Staff Sergeant James squinted at him suspiciously. What the hell are you on about? Before he could reply, thudding footsteps like hoofbeats thundered in the stairwell.
Oh, God, you've got to stop him,
Harper cried, grabbing James by his body armor. James shoved him, and Harper fell back, pinwheeling his arms to no avail. He struck a low chair-side table and cried out as he hit the ground. Don't you ever touch me, James spat. Fucking civvies, thinking you've got the run of everything. Coddled and spoiled. James was still ranting, but Harper didn't hear him. He was fixated on Pastor's leering yellow face as it appeared over the Staff Sergeant's shoulder. Pastor grabbed the man and spun him around. What the fuck? Was all James managed to utter before Pastor delivered a headbutt hard enough to cave in the man's face. Hot blood fell over Harper, and he screamed, staring down at the blood on his hands and his pants. Pastor dropped the man to the ground unceremoniously. The sharp bones protruding from his forehead were caked with gore. His expression changed, suddenly a mask of confusion, then of understanding.
You're a doctor, right?
Pastor said.
Please, you have to help me. It's like there's something in my bones that wants out, and I can't stop it. It just keeps pushing and pushing, and it wants you all dead, and I can't stop it. I'm losing me. Do you understand? I don't know how much more time I'll be in here, in my head, 'cause it won't stop. Oh God, help me. Help me.
A cacophony of cries and gunfire erupted in the lobby. The young SWAT guys Harper had run into earlier had opened fire, and Pastor jerked spasmodically with the impact of each bullet. Pastor fell. Harper should have been grateful, but instead he was horrified as he watched new white blood-slicked bone emerge from the man's wounds. The protrusions met and knitted together until they were flat plates of bone against his skin.
He's armoring himself,
Harper thought.
Jesus Christ, help us.
Pastor rose with a growl and sped towards his attacker, loping magnificently like a beast after prey, like he'd been doing it his whole life, like he was a different species evolved perfectly to have this form. Harper already knew how this was going to play out and wasted no time finding his footing and running for the door. The Texas morning was already too warm for him, but he savored every breath of fresh air as he ran across the parking lot, finally collapsing onto the manicured grass at the lot's edge. He stared up at the sky, his chest rising and falling, his hand shaking. It wasn't until then he noticed that the morning wasn't silent. Sirens seemed to come from everywhere, punctuated by random bursts of noise from car horns. Faint screams were carried to his ears from the slight morning breeze. From somewhere came the god-awful bang of two vehicles colliding. Finally, there came another sound, a screech that drowned everything else out. Two jets screamed through the sky above him. He didn't know what kind they were. He didn't know shit about jets. But he had seen enough movies to recognize the sound of missiles being unleashed, the telltale whoosh of their ignition, the shriek of their flight, towards millions of people, towards Houston. Harper didn't rise. He continued to stare into the blue, preferring to hear the end of the world rather than witness it with his own eyes.
Hope you enjoyed tonight's story, Derek's Destiny, written by Ashley Fontaine. Ashley Fontaine is a major writing contributor to Fear from the Heartland. Ms. Fontaine is an international best-selling author and has penned over 23 works in numerous genres. Her works can be found on Audible.com as well, including the first 2 books of the Legion novella series, narrated by me. To find more of her excellent work, check out her website at ashleyfontaine.net. That's Ashley, A-S-H-L-E-Y, Fontaine, F-O-N-T-A-I-N-N-E.net. Or connect with Ashley on Facebook at ashley.fontaine. In tonight's story, The Aqua Bird by Malcolm Tanner, the talents of Melissa Medina can be heard as Loretta and Jeb's mom. The Aqua Bird is a story of a young girl, Loretta, that lives in a very abusive environment. Her only escape from the terrible events she suffers is the pretty aqua bird she sees outside her window. But a black and gray ugly bird also sits in the same tree. She waves the ugly bird away and wants to always see the pretty bird. Her mental state begins to change after she runs away from home. She feels she has 2 personalities. One is a loving, caring person, the pretty aqua bird. The other, a soul that rages in anger from the abuse she suffered as a child, the black and gray bird. She meets a young boy, Jeb, after running away. They live together, moving from town to town, doing what Jeb calls righteous things to save other children from their own nightmarish existences. But their righteous deeds may not be so righteous after all. Sit back and listen to the story of a tortured and troubled pair. Are they the ugly bird or the pretty bird? Only you can decide. And now, The Aqua Bird. Chapter 1. The Beginning. Loretta could see 2 versions of the mockingbird in the tree outside her window, one with ugly gray and black feathers, the other with beautiful aqua feathers. The aqua bird was so much more pleasing to Loretta's sight. The black and gray mockingbird always landed first in the newly blossomed redbud tree. The black and gray bird seemed cold and insensitive, unable to know beauty. The aqua bird would always arrive and chase the gray bird away, puffing its chest out in pride.
That's me,
Loretta said to herself.
I'm the pretty bird.
Her friends would sometimes scoff at her words. Whether she was actually the gray bird or the pretty aqua bird depended on the mood she was in that day. Loretta's emerald green eyes saw the very best of herself. The Aqua bird, if you will. But there were times when her eyes turned a stone-cold gray, and she actually saw herself as the ugly gray and black feathered bird. She shook her head violently when she wanted it to go away, flailing her arms at the bird until she scared it off the beautiful branches. Loretta had always appeared confused about which color bird she was, even as a child growing up in the Missouri Ozarks. Loretta and her family, if that's what you called it, lived in a trailer with a couch in front. The couch sat in the front yard grass, which was worn and never mowed. Most of the grass was dead from the summer heat. The couch sat a few feet in front of the concrete block steps that led inside the trailer. Some of the windows were broken, and the siding was moldy all along the north side. Loretta's mother would scream, and her father would yell, making Loretta cover her ears. Loretta would sing nursery rhymes until her fear went away, kicking her feet outward, sometimes so fast and violent she did not realize she was bruising her heels against the front of the couch. Her brain spoke to her in words so fast and furious they made no sense. Loretta cried at first, but after a while, she no longer possessed tears to give. She felt her mind split into two parts. She felt she became two people. One person was helpful, nice, and caring. That was the Aqua bird. The other, well, she just denied the other person existed. It was rage and fury taking her to a new dimension, a dimension with no memory, one in which she could never recall her violent fury. That's when she was the black and gray feathered bird. It was the hitting that made Loretta really turn into the black and gray bird. Her father, Jimmy, liked bullying her mother. She would just go outside and sit on the couch, kicking her heels against its base until they were bruised, singing her repetitive rhymes. She was walking home one day at 16 and found a boy while hitchhiking on the road. He was older and stopped his pickup truck to ask her if she needed a ride. She climbed into his truck that day and never looked back at her parents' trailer she had once called home or hell. The boy's name was Jeb, and she would soon fall in love with him. He was kind and gentle to her, never yelling like her father or screaming like her mother. She was happy, and that is when the Aqua bird began to appear to her. She could see it clearly at least once every day, mostly in the morning when she looked outside at the redbuds, waking up with Jeb by her side in their current trailer in an old rundown park in rural Missouri. Her parents never tried to find her once she left. Loretta was out on her own, learning things a girl her age was actually too young to learn. She grew up much too fast. Sometimes Jeb would take care of kids, lost like them, trying to survive in the world. They were kids whose parents never came home and left them all alone to fend for themselves. Jeb gave Loretta a place to stay. There was no yelling or screaming. Jeb never yelled at Loretta. It was not always warm or cool enough, but they did have shelter. Many times they would find old abandoned places to stay until someone found them and they fled. Life on the road. Jeb stole food. He hunted food. He did whatever he could to help the both of them survive. Sometimes they would move into an abandoned trailer in an old park that no one owned anymore. But mostly, they found ones that were abandoned in empty fields or sparse woods. Sometimes they ate at food kitchens for the homeless, or others would give them money to eat. That is, if they weren't on the run. They seemed to be able to avoid the authorities many times for the evil they left behind them. Although it wasn't real, the Aqua bird was to Loretta. It calmed her after her episodes of anger and evil. As times passed, she engaged in many more angry episodes, but Jeb was always there to direct her anger in the direction of what he called righteous behavior, to use her sparks of anger for good. Well, you know, people like us, we are only helping the children, you know, Jeb would say.
But Jeb, they'll find us someday. They'll hurt us.
No, they won't, Loretta. I won't ever let them hurt you. Besides, what we did was not wrong. It freed children from those terrible people. Even though Jeb was kind to Loretta, he could be evil to others. He was evil to others because he grew up like Loretta. He lived in the same kinds of places with the same kinds of parents. He promised himself that he would help anyone with parents like his and Loretta's. Jeb always lived with a mean streak, one that cost Jeb's own father his life. Jeb's father came home drunk one afternoon. Jeb was supposed to have the work done. His father barreled through the door of the trailer, pushing Jeb's mother to the floor. He took off his belt and was going to teach Jeb a lesson for being lazy and not getting the grass mowed. His father went outside to find him. He walked all around the trailer until he saw the skirting underneath torn open. Now his father was really pissed. "Get your lazy ass out of there, boy. I told you to get that grass cut, and what did you do all day? Sit on your ass?" "No, Daddy, no. Don't hurt me, please." His father finally got a hold of his arm and struck him 3 times with the belt. He then kicked him square in the ass twice and then struck him in the face with his fist. Jeb lay there, bloody and scared. He would have no more of this, not ever again. This shit was going to stop right now. Jeb raised up to his knees as his father raised up to swing the belt at him one more time. Jeb crawled to his feet, his hunting knife he always carried in his jeans clenched tightly in his fist. He swung it toward his father's stomach. It plunged deep into his father's gut. The look of surprise and shock on his father's face did not move Jeb as he removed the knife and crimson red blood oozed from his father's stomach. For some reason, Jeb was not able to stop himself. His humiliation and rage left over from the beating he had just received drove him to plunge the knife again into the chest of his father. Again, then again, each time with more force as Jeb's rage gave him superior strength he did not know he possessed. His father finally succumbed to the vicious attack and lay flat on his back, looking up at the sky. He lay motionless, his eyes empty and hollow, lifeless. His mother ran to stop him.
Jeb, stop! Stop, please!
Jeb held the knife, dripping with his father's blood, and stood still like a statue. Jeb's breathing was fast and labored. His mother slowly removed the knife from his hand.
Run, Jeb. Run as fast as you can and never come back. It's the only way for you to survive. Run, Jeb!
His mother held the knife and watched Jeb run away.
My boy. My beautiful boy. It's the only way,
she thought within, as she laid plans to bury her husband's body in the woods. She would tell anyone asking about Jeb's father that he up and left the family and that Jeb ran away. Jeb was officially a missing person, but they would never find him. He would evade everyone. He would learn how to survive. It was now 2 years since Jeb killed his father. Jeb grew in size and was now more like a man than a boy. He still defended and protected Loretta, the one he loved with all his heart, just like he loved his mother. But he taught her that revenge against all that was evil to them was actually the right way to think about life. He would tell her, how were we supposed to end all the evil, especially the things that happened to kids like us? The cops? Family services? What do they do to stop that cruelty, the verbal and physical abuse, and them not caring none for us as kids? Loretta would listen to Jeb and thought him to be the smartest man in the world. They found the trailer they now lived in empty and abandoned. It was just like the others they discovered before on their travels. None of them seemed owned by anyone, and the trailers were always empty. They would steal things, furniture, lamps, anything to help them make their trailer seem nice. They put plastic in the windows to keep their trailer warm in the winter and stole fans to cool them in the summer. They moved from one to another as people ran them off or called the police to have them removed. They always seemed to stay one step ahead of the law. Loretta and Jeb always seemed to get away as Jeb would hear his mother's voice.
Run, Jeb. Run as fast as you can.
Loretta always marveled at how good Jeb was at staying hidden and not being found. He knew a lot about the woods and how to hide in them. He owned knives to ward off critters and to clean food for them to eat. Jeb came along and saved her from evil, and he was teaching her how to do the same for others. One day, they sat outside the trailer on a couch they got from the Christian Center and were talking. Loretta was mesmerized by his voice and what she figured was his wisdom. You see, Loretta, these damn people don't care about their kids. They only care about drinking that whiskey and yelling and screaming that they do at each other. Them poor little kids, they ain't got nothing to look forward to. They just like you and me. We's orphans, you know. So is them kids. They just don't know that yet, Jeb said.
But Jeb, it ain't right killing them people, is it? I mean, they ain't bothering us none.
Loretta, when you were little, did you want to leave that old place with those nasty folks?
Well, yes. I don't miss them people one bit. Not one.
You see then? It is righteous. We help them little ones that nobody cares for. Jeb and Loretta made the best of their homeless life, finding food in shelters, clothing at thrift shops, and any money they could steal from their victims. Those victims were not necessarily robbery victims. Oh no, they were actually victims of Jeb and Loretta's righteous behavior. Jeb always worried when he heard screams of pain and anger that someone was doing wrong. He felt he needed to help those suffering abuse. The abusers weren't victims at all to Jeb. They got what they damned well deserved, just like his father. He would usually bury them in shallow graves, many never to be found, as he and Loretta would leave a trail of carnage behind them. Jeb never looked back at his trail of blood and vengeance. After all, he felt what he was doing was right. But Loretta asked the Aqua bird when she would see it if they were doing right or wrong. In the end, Loretta would always puff out her chest and say to herself,
That's me. I'm the pretty bird.
One night, they were out walking and they heard yelling and screaming from another trailer in the park they stayed in. 2 children came flying out through the door and were crying. Jeb told them both to run far away. He pulled 2 knives from his jacket and gave one of the knives to Loretta. This was okay, Loretta thought. We're just puffing out our chests, just like the Aqua bird. She looked at Jeb with her green eyes and said,
You always told me it was okay if it was for a righteous reason.
Loretta then looked at the tree near the trailer where the kids ran from. The black and gray feathered mockingbird nodded its head at Loretta, giving her the signal to go ahead. She angered at the sight of that ugly bird, and she began to become that second person, the one with no memory. She felt the rage rise and build inside until she could no longer hold back the impending explosion. She spun quickly towards Jeb, her eyes meeting his eyes, and he just nodded his head in the affirmative as they walked inside the trailer. A bloody fury ensued. Loretta did things to the kid's mother she never thought possible before. She attacked the man holding the gun and slashed his throat from ear to ear, sending fountains of blood into the air. Filled with a dark, furious wrath, her hands and face quickly became bloodied as her righteous anger unleashed. The 2 made the news that day and were quickly arrested for double homicide. She was tried for murder in the 1st degree, but found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was institutionalized and forever caught in the crazy dreams about those they killed. Over and over the dreams would come. Doctors were never quite certain if she actually perceived the carnage she had committed. They placed straps around her, and Loretta fought and fought until the dreams subsided. The shot, the stabbings, the blood, the screams, they always came back. Chapter 2. The End. The gray-feathered mockingbird landed on a tree outside her window at the sanitarium. It sang a horrid tune. Loretta looked slowly over at the bird and sneered as sweat rolled down her cheeks and forehead, her hair completely soaking wet and smelling soured. It flew away. In its place, the Aqua mockingbird sat perched, echoing a much sweeter tune. The tune was righteous. Loretta's mouth transformed into a wide smile. The straps no longer hurt, and her breathing began to slow down. Each time a new episode took place, the gray bird appeared. She would stab at the bird with her hand in violent strokes. The ugly bird would leave, and the pretty bird would appear in its place. Loretta would then puff out her chest.
That's me,
she said aloud to herself.
I'm the pretty bird. Righteousness. I miss you, Jeb.
Jeb died 30 years earlier at the ripe age of 22 inside a trailer. Such a hard life he had lived in such a short time. No one ever told Loretta, not that her feeble, broken mind would have understood. She knew he was hurt by the gunshot, but she never knew he would die. She could only remember small bits and pieces of what happened that day. The gray-feathered mockingbird filled her with enough rage to explode. Loretta thought she would see Jeb soon. It was not to be. She lost all track of time with no sense of how old she was now. At 52 years old, for the past 32 years, Loretta saw the two birds at least once every single day. Each day, she shooed the gray bird away, and whenever she saw the aqua bird, she would then puff out her chest and relax enough to sleep. Jeb would watch her from his perch on the redbud tree, just out of reach, outside her window. His feathers are gray and dull. The ugly bird. He did not understand why she wanted to shoo him away. He was so good to her. He had shown her how to show mercy to the unwanted children and judgment to the nasty, neglectful parents. One day, the gray bird flew away and never came back. Loretta passed that day at the age of 54. She died from an epileptic seizure. The gray bird could no longer see her, and her empty chair reminded him of what he had lost. His reason for coming was gone. Loretta's dreams of blood, violence, stabbing, and cutting had ended. But the aqua bird, well, it left too. But a new one came back. It landed and perched back on the same redbud that had now grown and matured to a quite large tree. The mockingbird always came back every day of every year and watched over whoever was in that room sitting in that familiar chair in the sanitarium. It was the pretty bird's job. The patients had never had anyone else to watch over them, and now it was Loretta's turn to do for them what another pretty bird had done for her. That job was to shine that strange and mysterious light upon their face during their times of misery, so that they too could puff out their chests and say,
That's me. I'm the pretty bird.
West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentle slopes there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the shingled sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. The old folk have gone away, and foreigners do not like to live there. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It is not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that can be imagined. The place is not good for imagination, and does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, for old Ammy Pierce has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. Ammy, whose head has been a little queer for years, is the only one who still remains, or who ever talks of the strange days. And he dares to do this because his house is so near the open fields and the traveled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now, but people ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far toward the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of a returning wilderness, and some of them will doubtless linger, even when half the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then, the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far below blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one with the deep's secrets, one with the hidden lore of old ocean and all the mystery of primal earth. When I went into the hills and vales to survey for the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this in Arkham, and because that is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought the evil must be something which grandmas had whispered to children through centuries. The name, Blasted Heath, seemed to me very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of a Puritan people. Then, I saw that dark, westward tangle of glens and slopes for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but the shadow lurked always there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alleys between them, and the floor was too soft with the dank moss and mattings of infinite years of decay. In the open spaces, mostly along the line of the old road, there were little hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, and sometimes with only a lone chimney or fast-filling cellar. Weeds and briars reigned, and furtive wild things rustled in the undergrowth. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of perspective or chiaroscuro were awry. I did not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was no region to sleep in. It was too much like a landscape of Salvador Rosa, too much like some forbidden woodcut in a tale of terror. But even all this was not so bad as the Blasted Heath. I knew it the moment I came upon it at the bottom of a spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire. But why had nothing new ever grown over these 5 acres of gray desolation that sprawled open to the sky, like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance about approaching, and did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind on the broad expanse, but only a fine gray dust or ash, which no wind seemed ever to blow about. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks and stones of an old chimney and cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well, whose stagnant vapors played strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marveled no more at the frightened whispers of Arkham people. There had been no house or ruin near. Even in the old days, the place must have been lonely and remote. And at twilight, dreading to repass that ominous spot, I walked circuitously back to the town by the curious road on the south. I vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep, skyey voids above had crept into my soul. In the evening, I asked old people in Arkham about the Blasted Heath, and what was meant by that phrase, strange days, which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers except that all the mystery was much more recent than I had dreamt. It was not a matter of old legendary at all, but something within the lifetime of those who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and a family had disappeared or was killed. Speakers would not be exact, and because they all told me to pay no attention to old Ammy Pierce's crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in the ancient, tottering cottage where the trees first begin to get very thick. It was a fearsomely ancient place, and had begun to exude the faint miasmal odor which clings about houses that have stood too long. Only with persistent knocking could I rouse the aged man, and when he shuffled timidly to the door, could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not so feeble as I had expected, but his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothing and white beard made him seem very worn and dismal. Not knowing just how he could best be launched on his tales, I feigned a matter of business, told him of my surveying, and asked vague questions about the district. He was far brighter and more educated than I had been led to think, and before I knew it, had grasped quite as much of the subject as any man I had talked with in Arkham. He was not like other rustics I had known in the sections where reservoirs were to be. From him there were no protests at the miles of old wood and farmland to be blotted out, though perhaps there would have been had not his home lain outside the bounds of the future lake. Relief was all that he showed, relief at the doom of the dark, ancient valleys through which he had roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days, and with this opening, his husky voice sank low, while his body leaned forward, and his right forefinger began to point shakily and impressively. It was then that I heard the story, and as the rambling voice scraped and whispered on, I shivered again and again spite the summer day. Often, I had to recall the speaker from ramblings, piece out scientific points which he knew only by a fading parrot memory of professors' talk, or bridge over gaps where his sense of logic and continuity broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folk of Arkham would not speak much of the blasted heath. I hurried back before sunset to my hotel, unwilling to have the stars come out above me in the open, and the next day returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go into that dim chaos of old forest and slope again, or face another time that gray blasted heath where the black well yawned deep beside the tumbled bricks and stones. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those elder secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit that country by night. At least not when the sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. It all began, old Amy said, with a meteorite. Before that time there had been no wild legends at all since the witch trials, and even then these western woods were not feared half so much as the small island in the Miskatonic, where the devil held court beside a curious lone altar, older than the Indians. These were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. Then there had come that white noontide cloud, that string of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the valley far in the wood. And by night all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place. That was the house which had stood where the blasted heath was to come, the trim, white Nahum Gardner house, amidst its fertile gardens and orchards. Nahum had come to town to tell people about the stone, and dropped in at Amy Pierce's on the way. Amy was 40 then, and all the queer things were fixed very strongly in his mind. He and his wife had gone with the 3 professors from Miskatonic University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from unknown stellar space, and had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said, as he pointed out the big brownish mound above the ripped earth and charred grass near the archaic well sweep in his front yard. But the wise men answered that stones do not shrink. Its heat lingered persistently, and Nahum declared it had glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it with the geologist's hammer and found it was oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic, and they gouged rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it in an old pail borrowed from Nahum's kitchen, for even the small piece refused to grow cool. On the trip back, they stopped at Ammy's to rest and seemed thoughtful when Mrs. Pierce remarked that the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. Truly, it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they thought. The day after that, all this was in June of '82, the professors had trooped out again in great excitement. As they passed Ammy's, they told him what queer things the specimen had done, and how it had faded wholly away when they put it in a glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicon. It had acted quite unbelievably in that well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all, and showing no occluded gases when heated on charcoal, being wholly negative in the borax bead, and soon proving itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil it appeared highly malleable, and in the dark its luminosity was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had the college in a state of real excitement, and when, upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum, there was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science are wont to say when faced by the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same. Nitric acid and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invulnerability. Ammy had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the usual order of use. There were ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether, nauseous carbon disulfide, and a dozen others. But, although the weight grew steadily less as time passed, and the fragments seemed to be slightly cooling, there was no change in the solvents to show that they had attacked the substance at all. It was a metal, though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic for one thing, and after its immersion in the acid solvents there seemed to be the faint traces of the Wittgenstein figures found on meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, the testing was carried on in glass, and it was in a glass beaker that they left the chips made of the original fragment during the work. The next morning, both chips and beaker were gone without a trace, and only a charred spot marked the place on the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professors told Ammy as they paused at his door, and once more he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk, and even the sober professors could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space, except where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sages studied its surface curiously as they detached another and larger piece with hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and as they pried away the smaller mass, they saw that the core of the thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded in the substance. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it appeared to promise both brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. It left behind a hollow, spherical space, about 3 inches across, and all thought it probable that others would be discovered as the enclosing substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain, so, after a futile attempt to find additional globules by drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as its predecessor, Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight luminosity, cooling slightly in powerful acids, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air and attacking silicon compounds with mutual destruction as a result, it presented no identifying features whatsoever, and at the end of the tests, the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such dowered with outside properties and obedient to outside laws. That night there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they were met with bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within an hour the farmer saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard, and when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with a caved-in earth. Digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of the utter vanishment. The failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragment left carefully cased in lead. The fragment lasted a week, at the end of which nothing of value had been learned of it. When it was gone, no residue was left behind, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure they had indeed seen with waking eyes that cryptic vestige of the fathomless gulfs outside. That lone, weird message from other universes and other realms of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham papers made much of the incident with its collegiate sponsoring, and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent a scribe, and Nahum quickly became a kind of local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on the pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. That July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard at his haying in the 10-acre pasture across Chapman's Brook, his rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwonted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sour disappointment, for of all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early, and was very cold. Amy saw Nahum less often than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown taciturn, and were far from steady in their church-going or their attendance at the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve or melancholy no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then to poorer health and a feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone when he said he was disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. They were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but appeared to think they were not as characteristic of the anatomy of habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Amy listened without interest to this talk until one night, when he drove past Nahum's house in his sleigh on the way back from Clark's Corner. There had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leaps of that rabbit were longer than either Amy or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by a firm rein. Thereafter, Amy gave Nahum's tales more respect, and wondered why the gardener dogs seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys from Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, and not far from the Gardner place bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportion of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way impossible to describe, while its face had taken on an expression which no one ever saw in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened and threw the thing away at once, so that only their grotesque tales of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else, and early in March there was an awed discussion in Potter's General Store at Clark's Corners. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning and had noticed the skunk cabbages coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before, and they held strange colors that could not be put into any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horse had snorted at an odor which struck Stephen as wholly unprecedented. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth, and all agreed that plants of that kind ought never to sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before was freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth that there was poison in Nahum's ground. Of course it was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found that stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day, they paid Nahum a visit, but having no love of wild tales and folklore, were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, of course this was mere country talk, which such a phenomenon as the aerolite would be certain to start. There was really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rustics will say and believe anything. And so, all through the strange days the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, when given 2 files of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half later, recalled that the queer color of that skunk cabbage had been very like one of the anomalous bands of light shown by the meteor fragment in the college spectroscope, and, like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss, the samples in this analysis case gave the same odd bands at first, though later they lost the property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there was no wind, but even the gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthily listening, though not for any sound which they could consciously name. The listening was indeed rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed half to slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, till it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folks. When the early saxifrage came out, it had another strange color, not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editor of the Gazette, but that dignitary did not more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell a stolid city man about the way the great, overgrown mourning-cloaked butterflies behaved in connection with these saxifrages. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began that disuse of the road past Nahum's which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in strange colors, and through the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasturage there sprang up a bizarre growth which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere were those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased underlying primary tone, without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroots grew insolent in their chromatic perversion. Amy and the gardeners thought that most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that they reminded one of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped the summer's strange growths would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him, waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were better off being at school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in their aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something. They could not tell what. It was then that they owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of a maple against a moonlit sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now, yet it was none of Nahum's family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton, who drove by one night in ignorance of the country legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark, and the buggy lamps faint, but around a farm in the valley which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim, though distinct luminosity seemed to inhere in all the vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossoms alike, while at one moment a detached piece of the phosphorescence appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house, but toward the end of May the milk began to be bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, after which this trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in grass and leaves became apparent to the eye. All the verdure was going gray, and was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Amy was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amy do their errands in town. They were failing curiously both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her raving there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the county asylum, but let her wander about the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, when Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours. And before that month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as he now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this that the horses had stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking in their stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them, and when Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found, they were seen to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amy for his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end he could do nothing but drive it into the yard while the men used their own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough the hayloft for convenient pitching. And all the while, the vegetation was turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers, whose hues had been so strange, were graying now, and the fruit was coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed gray and distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollyhocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's oldest boy, Zenas, cut them down. The strangely puffed insects died about that time. Even the bees had left their hives and taken to the woods. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling to a grayish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife now had spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now, and when school opened, the boys did not go. But it was Amy, on one of his rare visits, who first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid, nor exactly salty, and Amy advised his friend to dig another well on higher ground until the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had by that time become callous to strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals, and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as if they walked half in another world, between lines of nameless guards to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into a inane titter or whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in an attic room across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some terrible language that was not of Earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse after the shutting away of the brother who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the mortality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly, and their meat being found dry and noisome upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes which no one could explain. Their meat was of course useless, and Nahum was at his wit's end. No rural veterinary would approach his place, and the city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle and falling to pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzles developed singular alterations. It was very inexplicable, for they had never been fed from the tainted vegetation. Then, something struck the cows. Certain areas, or sometimes the whole body, would be uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapses or disintegrations were common. And the last stages, and death was always the result. There would be a graying and turning brittle, like that which beset the hogs. There could be no question of poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus, for what live beast of earth can pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease, yet what disease could wreak such results was beyond any mind's guessing. When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead, and the dogs had run away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night, and were never heard of again. The 5 cats had left some time before, but their going was scarcely noticed since there now seemed to be no mice, and only Mrs. Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Amy's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room, and it had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot behind the farm, and had put therein what he found. There could have been nothing from outside, for the small barred window and locked door were intact, but it was much as it had been in the barn. Amy and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror seemed to cling round the Gardners and all they touched, and the very presence of one in the house was a breath from regions unnamed and unnameable. Amy accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and did what he might to calm the hysterical sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him, and Amy thought that his fate was very merciful. Now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic, and in response to an inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approached, Amy managed to get away, for not even friendship could make him stay in that spot when the faint glow of vegetation began, and the trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Amy that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent ever so slightly. But had he been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him, he must inevitably have turned a total maniac. In the twilight he hastened home, the screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. 3 days later, Nahum burst into Amy's kitchen in the early morning, and in the absence of his host, stammered out a desperate tale once more, while Mrs. Pierce listened in a clutching fright. It was little Merwin this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and pail for water, and had never come back. He had been going to pieces for days, and hardly knew what he was about. Screamed at everything. There had been a frantic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken, and of the child himself, no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too, but when dawn came, and the man had plodded back from his all-night search of the woods and fields, he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparently somewhat melted mass of iron which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent handle and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Mrs. Pierce was blank, and Amy, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around who shunned all gardeners now. No use either in telling the city people at Arkham who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Merwin was gone. Something was creeping and creeping and waiting to be seen and heard. Nahum would go soon. He wanted Amy to look after his wife and Zenas if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy what for, since he had always walked uprightly in the Lord's ways so far as he knew. For over 2 years, Amy saw nothing of Nahum, and then, worried about what might have happened, he overcame his fears and paid the gardener place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment, the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Grayish withered grass and leaves on the ground, vines falling in brittle wreckage from the archaic walls and gables, and great bare trees clawing up at the gray November sky with a studied malevolence which Amy could not but feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive, after all. He was weak and lying on a couch in the low-ceiled kitchen, but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenas. The room was deadly cold, and as Amy visibly shivered, the host shouted huskily to Zenas for more wood. Wood, indeed, was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty, with a cloud of soot blowing about in the chill wind that came down the chimney. Presently, Nahum asked if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable, and then Amy saw what had happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Amy could get no clear data at all about the missing Zenas. In the well. He lives in the well," was all that the clouded father would say. Then there flashed across the visitor's mind a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. "Nabby?" "Why, here she is," was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Amy soon saw that he must search for himself. Leaving the harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from their nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried various keys of the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Amy threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Amy could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further he had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and had not a present horror numbed him, he would have thought of the globule in the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about the horror was that it very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble, Amy would give me no added particulars of this scene, but the shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes cruelly judged by the law. I gather that no moving thing was left in that attic room, and that to leave anything capable of motion there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad, but Amy walked conscious through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Amy heard a thud below him. He even thought a scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapor which had brushed by him in that frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sounds below. Indubitably, there was a sort of heavy dragging, and a most detestably sticky noise as of some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense goaded to feverish heights, he thought unaccountably of what he had seen upstairs. Good God, what eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared move neither backward nor forward, but stood there, trembling, at the black curve of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the scene burned itself into his brain. The sounds, the sense of dread, expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow step. Unmerciful heaven! The faint but unmistakable luminosity of all the woodwork in sight, steps, sides, exposed lathes and beams alike. Then there burst forth a frantic whinny from Amy's horse outside, followed at once by a clatter which told of a frenzied runaway. In another moment, horse and buggy had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightened man on the dark stairs to guess what had sent them. But that was not all. There had been another sound out there, a sort of liquid splash. Water. It must have been the well. He had left Hero untied near it, and a buggy wheel must have brushed the coping and knocked in a stone. And still the pale phosphorescence glowed in that detestably ancient woodwork. God, how old the house was. Most of it built before 1670, and the gambrel roof no later than 1730. A feeble scratching on the floor downstairs now sounded distinctly, and Amy's grip tightened on a heavy stick he had picked up in the attic for some purpose. Slowly nerving himself, he finished his descent and walked boldly toward the kitchen. But he did not complete the walk because what he sought was no longer there. It had come to meet him, and it was still alive after a fashion. Whether it had crawled or whether it had been dragged by any external forces, Amy could not say, but the death had been at it. Everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapse, graying, and disintegration were already far advanced. There was a horrible brittleness, and dry fragments were scaling off. Amy could not touch it, but looked horrifiedly into the distorted parody that had been a face. What was it, Nahum? What was it? He whispered, and the cleft, bulging lips were just able to crackle out a final answer. Nothing. Nothing. The color, it burns. Cold and wet, but it burns. It lived in the well. I seen it. A kinda smoke, just like the flowers last spring. The well shone at night. Thad and Merwin, and Zenith. Everything alive, sucking the life out of everything. In that stone. Must have come in that stone and poisoned the whole place. Don't know what it was, that round thing the men from the college dug out of the stone. They smashed it. It were the same color. Just the same. Like the flowers and the plants. Must have been more of them. Seeds, they growed. I seen it the first time this week. Must have got strong on Zenith. He was big boy, full of life. It beats down your mind, and then it gets you. Burns you up. And the well water, you was right about that. It's evil water. Zenith never came back from the well. Can't get away. Draws you. You know something's coming, but tain't no use. I seen it time and again since Zenith was took. Oh, where's Nabby, Hammy? My head's no good. I don't know how long since I fed her. It'll get her if we ain't careful. Just a color. Her face is getting to have that color sometimes towards night. And it burns and sucks. It come from some place where things ain't as they is here. One of them professors said so. He was right. Oh. Look out, Hammy. It'll do something more. Sucks the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could speak no more because it had completely caved in. Amy laid a red-checked tablecloth over what was left and reeled out the back door into the fields. He climbed the slope to the 10-acre pasture and stumbled home by the north road and the woods. He could not pass that well from which his horses had run away. They had looked at it through the window and had seen that no stone was missing from the rim. Then, the lurching buggy had not dislodged anything after all. The splash had been something else. Something which went into the well after it had done with poor Nahum. When Amy reached his house, the horses and buggy had arrived before him and thrown his wife into fits of anxiety. Reassuring her without explanations, he set out at once for Arkham and notified the authorities that the Gardner family was no more. He indulged in no details, but merely told of the deaths of Nahum and Nabby, that of Thaddeus being already known, and mentioned that the cause seemed to be the same strange ailment which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merwin and Zenith had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end, Amy was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm, together with the coroner, the medical examiner, and the veterinary who had treated the diseased animals. He went much against his will, for the afternoon was advancing and he feared the fall of night over that accursed place. But it was some comfort to have so many people with him. The 6 men drove out in a Democrat wagon, following Amy's buggy, and arrived at the pest-ridden farmhouse about 4 o'clock. Used as the officers were to gruesome experiences, not one remained unmoved at what was found in the attic and under the red-checked tablecloth on the floor below. The whole aspect of the farm, with its gray desolation, was terrible enough. But those 2 crumbling objects were beyond all bounds. no one could look at them, and even the medical examiner admitted that there was very little to examine. Specimens could be analyzed, of course, so he busied himself in obtaining them. And here it develops that a very puzzling aftermath occurred at the college laboratory, where the 2 vials of dust were finally taken. Under the spectroscope, both samples gave off an unknown spectrum, in which many of the baffling bands were precisely like those which the strange meteor had yielded in the previous year. The property of emitting this spectrum vanished in a month, the dust thereafter consisting mainly of alkaline phosphates and carbonates. Amy would not have told the men about the well if he had thought they meant to do anything then and there. It was getting towards sunset, and he was anxious to be away, but he could not help glancing nervously at the stony curb by the great sweep, and when a detective questioned him, he admitted that Nahum had feared something down there so much so that he had never even thought of searching it for Merwin or Zenas. After that, nothing would do but that they emptied and explored the well immediately, so Amy had to wait trembling while pail after pail of rank water was hauled up and splashed on the soaking ground outside. The men sniffed in disgust at the fluid, and toward the last held their noses against the fetor they were uncovering. It was not so long a job as they had feared it would be, since the water was phenomenally low. There is no need to speak to exactly of what they found. Merwin and Zenas were both there, in part, though the vestiges were mainly skeletal. There were also a small deer and a large dog in about the same state, and a number of bones of small animals. The ooze and slime at the bottom seemed inexplicably porous and bubbling, and a man who descended on handholds with a long pole found that he could sink the wooden shaft to any depth in the mud of the floor without meeting any solid obstruction. Twilight had now fallen, and lanterns were brought from the house. Then, when it was seen that nothing further could be gained from the well, everyone went indoors and conferred in the ancient sitting room while the intermittent light of a spectral half-moon played wanly on the gray desolation outside. The men were frankly nonplussed by the entire case and could find no convincing common element to link the strange vegetable conditions, the unknown disease of livestock and humans, and the unaccountable deaths of Merwin and Zenas in the tainted well. They had heard the common country talk, it is true, but could not believe that anything contrary to natural law had occurred. No doubt the meteor had poisoned the soil, but the illness of persons and animals who had eaten nothing grown in that soil was another matter. Was it the well water? Very possibly. It might be a good idea to analyze it, but what peculiar madness could have made both boys jump into the well? Their deeds were so similar, and the fragments showed that they had both suffered from the gray, brittle death. Why was everything so gray and brittle? It was the coroner, seated near a window overlooking the yard, who first noticed the glow about the well. Night had finally set in, and all the abhorrent ground seemed faintly luminous with more than the fitful moonbeams. But this new glow was something definite and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from a searchlight, giving dull reflections in the little ground pools where the water had been emptied. It had a very queer color, and as all the men clustered round the window, Amy gave a violent start, for this strange beam of ghastly miasma was to him of no unfamiliar hue. He had seen that color before, and feared to think what it might mean. He had seen it in the nasty, brittle globule in that aerolite 2 summers ago, had seen it in the crazy vegetation of the springtime, and had thought he had seen it for an instant that very morning against the small barred window of that terrible attic room where nameless things had happened. It had flashed there a second, and a clammy and hateful current of vapor had brushed past him, and then poor Nahum had been taken by something of that color. He had said so at last, said it was like the globule and the plants. After that had come the runaway in the yard and the splash in the well, and now that well was belching forth to the night a pale, insidious beam of the same demoniac tint. It does credit to the alertness of Amy's mind that he puzzled even at that tense moment over a point which was essentially scientific. He could not but wonder at his gleaning of the same impression from a vapor glimpsed in the daytime against a window opening on the morning sky, and from a nocturnal exhalation seen as a phosphorescent mist against the black and blasted landscape. It wasn't right. It was against nature, and he thought of those terrible last words of his stricken friend. "It come from some place where things aren't as they is here. One of them professors said so." All 3 horses outside, tied to a pair of shriveled saplings by the road, were now neighing and pawing frantically. The wagon driver startled for the door to do something, but Amy laid a shaky hand on his shoulder. "Don't go out there," he whispered. "There's more to this nor what we know. Nahum said something lived in the well that sucks your life out. He said it must be something growed from a round ball like one we saw and seen that meteor stone what fell a year ago June. Sucks and burns," he said, "and it's just a cloud of color, like that light out there now, that you can hardly see and can't tell what it is. Nahum thought it feeds on everything living and gets stronger all the time. He said he's seen it this last week. Must be something from a way off in the sky like the men from the college last year says the meteor stone was. The way it's made and the way it works ain't like no way of God's world. It's something from beyond." So, the men paused indecisively as the light from the well grew stronger, and the hitched horses pawed and whinnied in increasing frenzy. It was truly an awful moment, with terror in that ancient and accursed house itself. 4 monstrous sets of fragments, 2 from the house and 2 from the well and the woodshed behind, and that shaft of unknown and unholy iridescence from the slimy depths in front. Amy had restrained the driver on impulse, forgetting how uninjured he himself was after the clammy brushing of that colored vapor in the attic room. But perhaps it is just as well that he acted as he did. No one will ever know what was abroad that night, and though the blasphemy from beyond had not so far hurt any human of unweakened mind, there is no telling what it might not have done at that last moment, and with its seemingly increased strength and the special signs of purpose it was soon to display beneath the half-clouded moonlit sky. All at once, one of the detectives at the window gave a short, sharp gasp. The others looked at him, and then quickly followed his own gaze upward to the point at which its idle straying had been suddenly arrested. There was no need for words. What had been disputed in country gossip was disputable no longer, and it is because of the thing which every man of that party agreed in whispering later on, that the strange days are never talked about in Arkham. It is necessary to premise that there was no wind at that hour of the evening. One did arise not long afterward, but there was absolutely none then. Even the dry tips of the lingering hedge mustard, gray and blighted, and the fringe on the roof of the standing Democrat wagon were unstirred. And yet, amid that tense, godless calm, the high bare boughs of all the trees in the yard were moving. They were twitching morbidly and spasmodically, clawing in convulsive and epileptic madness at the moonlit clouds, scratching impotently in the noxious air, as if jerked by some allied and bodiless line of linkage with subterranean horrors writhing and struggling below the black roots. Not a man breathed for several seconds. Then, a cloud of darker depth passed over the moon, and the silhouette of clutching branches faded out momentarily. At this, there was a general cry, muffled with awe but husky, and almost identical from every throat. For the terror had not faded with the silhouette, and in a fearsome instant of deeper darkness, the watcher saw wriggling at that treetop height 1,000 tiny points of faint and unhallowed radiance, tipping each bough like the fire of St. Elmo, or the flames that come down on the apostles' heads at Pentecost. It was a monstrous constellation of unnatural light, like a glutted swarm of corpse-fed fireflies dancing hellish sarabands over an accursed marsh, and its color was that same nameless intrusion which Amy had come to recognize and dread. All the while, the shaft of phosphorescence from the well was getting brighter and brighter, bringing to the minds of the huddled men a sense of doom and abnormality which far outtraced any image their conscious minds could form. It was no longer shining out. It was pouring out. And as the shapeless stream of unplaceable color left the well, it seemed to flow directly into the sky. The veterinary shivered and walked to the front door to drop the heavy extra bar across it. Amy shook no less, and had to tug and point for lack of controllable voice when he wished to draw notice to the growing luminosity of the trees. The neighing and stamping of the horses had become utterly frightful, but not a soul of that group in the old house would have ventured forth for any earthly reward. With the moments, the shining of the trees increased, while their restless branches seemed to strain more and more toward verticality. The wood of the well sweep was shining now, and presently a policeman dumbly pointed to some wooden sheds and beehives near the stone wall in the west. They were commencing to shine too, though the tethered vehicles of the visitors seemed so far unaffected. Then, there was a wild commotion and clopping in the road, and as Amy quenched the lamp for better seeing, they realized that the span of frantic grays had broken their sapling and run off with the Democrat wagon. The shock served to loosen several tongues, and embarrassed whispers were exchanged. "It spreads on everything organic that's been round here," muttered the medical examiner. No one replied, but the man who had been in the well gave a hint that his long pole must have stirred up something intangible. "It was awful," he added. "There were no bottom at all, just ooze and bubbles, and the feeling of something lurking under there." Amy's horse still pawed and screamed deafeningly in the road outside, and nearly drowned its owner's faint quaver as he mumbled his formless reflections. "It come from that stone. It growed down there. Got everything living. Fed itself on a mind and body. Had, and Merwin, and Zenis, and Nabby. Nahum was the last. They all drunk the water. It got strong on 'em. It come from beyond, where things ain't like they be here. Now, it's gone home." At this point, as the column of unknown color flared suddenly stronger and began to weave itself into fantastic suggestions of shape, which each spectator described differently, there came from poor tethered hero such a sound as no man before or since ever heard from a horse. Every person in that low-pitched sitting room stopped his ears, and Amy turned away from the window in horror and nausea. Words could not convey it. When Amy looked out again, the hapless beast lay huddled inert on the moonlit ground, between the splintered shafts of the buggy. That was the last of Hero, till they buried him next day. But the present was no time to mourn, for almost at this instant a detective silently called attention to something terrible in the very room with them. In the absence of the lamplight, it was clear that a faint phosphorescence had begun to pervade the entire apartment. It glowed on the broad planked floor and the fragment of rag carpet, and shimmered over the sashes of the small paned windows. It ran up and down the exposed corner posts, coruscated about the shelf and mantel, and infected the very doors and furniture. Each minute saw it strengthen, and at last it was very plain that healthy living things must leave that house. Amy showed them the back door and the path up through the fields to the 10-acre pasture. They walked and stumbled as in a dream, and did not dare look back till they were far away on the high ground. They were glad of the path, for they could not have gone the front way, by that well. It was bad enough passing the glowing barn and sheds and those shining orchard trees with their gnarled, fiendish contours. But thank heaven the branches did their worst twisting high up. The moon went under some very black clouds as they crossed the rustic bridge over Chapman's Brook, and it was blind groping from there to the open meadows. When they looked back toward the valley and the distant Gardner place at the bottom, they saw a fearsome sight. At the farm was shining with a hideous, unknown blend of color, trees, buildings, and even such grass and herbage as had not been wholly changed to lethal gray brittleness. The boughs were all straining skyward, tipped with tongues of foul flame, and lambent tricklings of the same monstrous fire were creeping about the ridgepoles of the house, barn, and sheds. It was a scene from a vision of Fuseli, and over all the rest reigned that riot of luminous amorphousness, that alien and undimensioned rainbow of cryptic poison from the well, seething, feeling, lapping, reaching, scintillating, straining, and malignly bubbling in its cosmic and unrecognizable chromaticism. Then, without warning, the hideous thing shot vertically up toward the sky like a rocket or meteor, leaving behind no trail, and disappearing through a round and curiously regular hole in the clouds before any man could gasp or cry out. No watcher can ever forget that sight, and Amy stared blankly at the stars of Cygnus, Deneb twinkling above the others, where the unknown color had melted into the Milky Way. But his gaze was the next moment called swiftly to earth by the crackling in the valley. It was just that, only a wooden ripping and crackling, and not an explosion, as so many others of the party vowed. Yet the outcome was the same, for in one feverish kaleidoscopic instant there burst up from that doomed and accursed farm a gleamingly eruptive cataclysm of unnatural sparks and substance, blurring the glance of the few who saw it, and sending forth to the zenith a bombarding cloudburst of such colored and fantastic fragments as our universe must needs disown. Through quickly reclosing vapors they followed the great morbidity that had vanished, and in another second they had vanished too. Behind and below was only a darkness, to which men dared not return, and all about was a mounting wind which seemed to sweep down in black frore gusts from interstellar space. It shrieked and howled, and lashed the fields and distorted woods in a mad cosmic frenzy, till soon the trembling party realized it would be no use waiting for the moon to show what was left down there at Nahum's. Too awed even to hint theories, the 7 shaking men trudged back toward Arkham by the North Road. Amy was worse than his fellows, and begged them to see him inside his own kitchen, instead of keeping straight on to town. He did not wish to cross the blighted wind-whipped woods alone to his home on the main road, for he had an added shock that the others were spared, and was crushed forever with a brooding fear he dared not even mention for many years to come. As the rest of the watchers on that tempestuous hill had stolidly set their faces toward the road, Amy had looked back an instant at the shadowed valley of desolation so lately sheltering his ill-starred friend. And from that stricken, faraway spot, he had seen something feebly rise, only to sink down again upon the place from which the great, shapeless horror had shot into the sky. It was just a color, but not any color of earth or heavens. And because Amy recognized that color and knew that this last faint remnant must still lurk down there in the well, he has never been quite right since. Amy would never go near the place again. It is 44 years now since the horror happened, but he has never been there, and will be glad when the new reservoir blots it out. I shall be glad too, for I do not like the way the sunlight changed color around the mouth of that abandoned well I passed. I hope the water will always be very deep, but even so, I shall never drink it. I do not think I shall visit the Arkham country hereafter. 3 of the men who had been with Amy returned the next morning to see the ruins by daylight, but there were not any real ruins, only the bricks of the chimney, the stones of the cellar, some mineral and metallic litter here and there, and the rim of that nefandous well. Save for Amy's dead horse, which they towed away and buried, and the buggy which they shortly returned to him, everything that had been living had gone. 5 eldritch acres of dusty gray desert remained, nor has anything ever grown there since. To this day it sprawls open to the sky like a great spot, eaten by acid in the woods and fields, and the few who have ever dared glimpse it in spite of the rural tales have named it the Blasted Heath. The rural tales are queer. They might be even queerer if city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyze the water from that disused well, or the gray dust that no wind seems to disperse. Botanists, too, want to study the stunted flora on the borders of that spot, for they might shed light on the country notion that the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps an inch a year. People say the color of the neighboring herbage is not quite right in the spring, and that wild things leave queer prints in the light winter snow. Snow never seems so heavy on the Blasted Heath as it is elsewhere. Horses, the few that are left in this motor age, grow skittish in the silent valley, and hunters cannot depend on their dogs too near the splotch of grayish dust. They say the mental influences are very bad too. Numbers went queer in the years after Nahum's taking, and always they lacked the power to get away. Then the stronger-minded folk all left the region, and only the foreigners tried to live in the crumbling old homesteads. They could not stay, though, and one sometimes wonders what insight beyond ours their wild, weird stories of whispered magic have given them. Their dreams at night, they protest, are very horrible in that grotesque country, and surely the very look of the dark realm is enough to stir a morbid fancy. No traveler has ever escaped a sense of strangeness in those deep ravines, and artists shiver as they paint thick woods, whose mystery is as much of the spirits as of the eye. I myself am curious about the sensation I derived from my one lone walk before Amy told me his tale. When twilight came, I had vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep sky voids above had crept into my soul. Do not ask me for my opinion. I do not know, that is all. There was no one but Amy to question, for Arkham people will not talk about the strange days, and all 3 professors who saw the aerolite in its colored globule are dead. There were other globules. Depend upon that. One must have fed itself and escaped, and probably there was another which was too late. No doubt it is still down the well. I know there was something wrong with the sunlight I saw above that miasmal brink. The rustics say the blight creeps an inch a year, so perhaps there is a kind of growth or nourishment even now. But whatever demon hatchling is there, it must be tethered to something or else it would quickly spread. Is it fastened to the roots of those trees that claw the air? One of the current Arkham tales is about fat oaks that shine and move as they ought not to do at night. What it is, only God knows. In terms of matter, I suppose the thing Amy described would be called a gas. But this gas obeyed the laws that are not of our cosmos. This was no fruit of such worlds and suns as shine on the telescopes and photographic plates of our observatories. This was no breath from the skies whose motions and dimensions our astronomers measure, or deem too vast to measure. It was just a color, out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity, beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra-cosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. I doubt very much if Amy consciously lied to me, and I do not think his tale was all a freak of madness as the townsfolk had forewarned. Something terrible came to the hills and valleys on that meteor, and something terrible, though I know not in what proportion, still remains. I shall be glad to see the water come. Meanwhile, I hope nothing will happen to Amy. He saw so much of the thing, and its influence was so insidious. Why has he never been able to move away? How clearly he recalled those dying words of Nahum's. Can't get away. Drowsy. You know something's coming, but 'tain't no use. Amy's such a good old man. When the Reservoir Gang gets to work, I must write the chief engineer to keep a sharp watch on him. I would hate to think of him as the gray, twisted, brittle monstrosity, which persists more and more in troubling my sleep.
Chilling tales for dark nights.